He thought every person had a price. She proved him wrong with just 5 words. See the moment the alpha met his match, read the full story now. He was a miniature prince in a pressed tuxedo, violently dragged through the filth of a subway station by a man with a jagged scar. I knew instantly that the weeping child was worth millions, and that the scream dying in his throat was about to get us both killed. For 6 months, I had been a Lara Vance, a ghost in a stained, oversized coat, invisible to the passing world. But when I saw the boy's terrified eyes, the survival instinct that kept me alive on the streets vanished. The kidnappers saw a homeless woman, I saw a target. Gripping the jagged neck of a shattered vodka bottle, I didn't run away, I lunged. The scene shifts violently from the grime of the subway to the cold, sterile luxury of a penthouse office. Smith Douglas, the city's most feared alpha, stared at me with eyes like ice. He didn't hug his son, he scanned the perimeter. Then, he slid a blank check across his mahogany desk, right next to a loaded Glock. Name your price for your silence, he growled, assuming I was just another opportunist. He expected me to take the money and vanish. Instead, I pushed the check back and pointed a shaking finger at his blacked-out security screens. I don't want your money, Mr. Douglas. I want the traitor standing in this room who turned your cameras off 5 minutes before your son was taken. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The air in the penthouse office was thin and smelled of expensive cedar and cold, calculated power. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the metallic tang of blood and the scent of damp concrete that still clung to my skin. I stood in the center of the room, a jagged, human-shaped tear in the tapestry of Smith Douglas's perfect world. My boots, caked with the filth of the 4th Street station, left muddy imprints on a hand-knotted Persian rug that probably cost more than the apartment I'd lost 6 months ago. Smith Douglas didn't look like a man who had just nearly lost his legacy. He looked like a predator who had found a fly in his soup and was deciding whether to crush it or study it. He remained seated behind a desk carved from a single slab of mahogany, his silhouette framed by the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the shimmering, uncaring city. His suit was charcoal, his shirt a crisp, blinding white, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were the color of the Atlantic in midwinter. The boy, Toby, had been whisked away by a nanny the moment we crossed the threshold, his small, tuxedo-clad frame still trembling. Smith hadn't even touched him. He had simply looked the boy over for physical damage and nodded once. Now, silence stretched between us, thick enough to choke on. Smith reached into his desk drawer with a slow, deliberate movement. He didn't pull out a thank you card. He laid a blank check on the mahogany surface, and next to it, with a heavy, metallic clack, a loaded Glock 17. The check is for your silence, Smith growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the marrow in my bones. The gun is for the alternative. I don't like loose ends, and I don't like debts. Write a number that makes you feel comfortable, walk out of here, and forget you ever saw my son's face. He thought he had me pegged. To him, I was just another piece of city refuse, a scavenger who had gotten lucky and was looking for a payday. He saw the oversized, grease-stained coat and the matted hair, and he assumed my soul was as worn out as my shoes. I looked at the check. Then I looked at the gun. Finally, I looked at him. I could feel the adrenaline from the subway fight beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, sharpened clarity. You're making a mistake, Mr. Douglas, I said. My voice was raspy from disuse, but it didn't shake. You're treating this like a kidnapping. It wasn't. It was an extraction. Smith's jaw tightened, a small muscle leaping in his cheek. I'm not in the mood for a street dweller's philosophy. Take the money and go before I decide you're more of a liability than a witness. I didn't reach for the check. Instead, I stepped forward, ignoring the way his hand hovered inches from the firearm. I pointed a dirty, calloused finger toward the wall of blackout security monitors behind him, a state-of-the-art command center that should have seen the kidnappers coming from 3 blocks away. You have 24-hour surveillance on that station entrance, I said, my voice gaining strength. You have thermal imaging, facial recognition, and a rapid response team that's supposed to be on site in 3 minutes. But the cameras at the north entrance went dark 5 minutes before that man grabbed Toby. Not a glitch, not a power surge. A manual override from a Tier 1 administrative login. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Smith's eyes narrowed, the ice in them turning to flint. He didn't move, but the air around him hummed with a sudden, lethal tension. "How would a woman like you know anything about my security protocols?" he asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. "I know that a traitor isn't some ghost in the machine," I replied, turning my head slightly to glance at the 2 stone-faced security guards standing by the heavy oak doors. One of them, a man with a military fade and a nervous twitch in his left hand, shifted his weight. "He's standing in this room. He's the one who turned the cameras off, and he's the one who told that man with the scar exactly where the boy would be." I pushed the blank check back toward him, the paper sliding across the wood like a discarded insult. "I don't want your money, Mr. Douglas. I want a job. You have a rat in your house, and your high-priced security team is too compromised to find him. I've been living in the shadows for 6 months. I see the things your alphas are too proud to look at. You need someone who doesn't exist to find the person who's trying to destroy you." Smith Douglas leaned back, his gaze raking over me again, but this time, he wasn't looking at the rags. He was looking at the woman underneath them. He saw the way I balanced my weight, ready to move. He saw the lack of fear in my eyes. He picked up the check, crumpled it into a ball, and dropped it into the wastebasket. He didn't touch the gun. "What makes you think I won't just kill you right now for knowing too much?" he asked. I gave him a thin, jagged smile, the smile of a woman who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "Because if you were going to kill me, you wouldn't have wasted the ink on the check. You're a businessman, Smith. And right now, I'm the only asset you have that isn't for sale." He stared at me for a long beat, the silence returning, but the energy had shifted. The predator had found something more interesting than a fly. He had found a weapon. "Clean up," Smith said finally, standing up and buttoning his blazer. "You start at dawn. If you're lying to me, Alara Vance, you'll wish you had stayed in that subway." I didn't blink. "I'll see you at sunrise, Mr. Douglas." The transformation from a subway ghost to a resident of the Douglas estate began with a shower so hot it turned my skin a raw, angry red. For 6 months, I had carried the city's grime like a second skin, a protective layer of filth that ensured no one looked at me long enough to see the woman hiding underneath. As the gray water spiraled down the drain of the marble guest suite, I felt that armor dissolve. In its place was a cold, sharp-edged hollow, the part of me that had been trained to survive long before I ever hit the streets. I dressed in the clothes they had left for me, a simple black turtleneck and trousers. They were anonymous, functional, and fit like a glove. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see Alara the vagrant. I saw Alara the predator. My hair was pulled back so tight it pulled at my temples, revealing the jagged scar along my hairline that I usually kept hidden. I stepped into the main hallway of the penthouse, my footsteps silent on the polished floors. The morning sun was bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the minimalist furniture. I didn't have to wait long for the welcome committee. "You're late," a voice barked. I turned to see Marcus, the head of Douglas's security detail. He was a wall of a man, his suit jacket straining against shoulders built in a gym rather than a war zone. He was the man I had noticed in the office last night, the one with the twitch. Up close, he smelled of expensive aftershave and arrogance. "The sun isn't even fully up, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of the rasp from the night before. "And unless you've fixed the blind spot on the East Service elevator since 2 a.m., I'd say you have bigger problems than my punctuality." Marcus's face darkened, a vein throbbing in his thick neck. He stepped into my personal space, trying to use his height to dwarf me. "Listen to me, girl. I don't care what kind of fairy tale you spun for Mr. Douglas last night. To me, you're just a lucky rat who crawled out of a hole. You're here to watch the boy, not to play detective. You stay in your lane, or I'll make sure you end up back in the gutter, in pieces. I didn't flinch. Instead, I stepped closer, until our chests were inches apart. I could see the tiny burst capillaries in his eyes. You think I'm a rat? That's fine. Rats know where the rot is. And right now, Marcus, the rot in this building is so thick I can taste it. If you were as good at your job as you are at posturing, that boy wouldn't have been in a subway station yesterday. I felt his hand twitch toward the holster at his hip, but a sharp, rhythmic tapping from the doorway stopped him. Smith Douglas stood there, a tablet in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. He didn't look like he had slept. He watched us with the detached interest of a man watching two dogs snarl over a bone. Marcus, Smith said, his voice like a velvet hammer. Go check the perimeter. Again. Marcus glared at me one last time before retreating, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Smith didn't acknowledge the tension. He simply looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the scar at my hairline. He doesn't like you, Smith noted. Competence is rarely popular with the incompetent, I replied. He's loyal. Or at least, he has been for 5 years. Smith took a sip of his coffee. Leo is in the playroom. He hasn't spoken since we brought him home. He won't eat. The previous nannies couldn't handle his sensitivity. See if your street-honed instincts can do better. The playroom was a glass-walled cavern filled with more toys than a small village would see in a lifetime, yet it felt like a tomb. Leo was sitting in the center of a vast, white rug, still wearing the tuxedo pants from the day before, though the jacket was gone. He was clutching a small, plastic dinosaur so hard his knuckles were white. I didn't approach him. I didn't offer a hug or a sweet word. I knew what it was like to be the center of a storm and have everyone look at you like you were broken. I sat on the floor near the door, leaning my back against the wall, and pulled a small, silver folding knife from my pocket, a relic I'd managed to keep hidden through the entire cleaning process. I picked up a discarded wooden block from a nearby set and began to shave off thin, curling ribbons of cedar. The scritch-scritch of the blade was the only sound in the room. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Leo's head turned slightly. His eyes, enormous and haunted, tracked the movement of my hands. He didn't see a nanny. He saw the woman who had used a broken vodka bottle to tear through the man who had hurt him. Is that for killing? His voice was a tiny, fragile thread. I didn't stop carving. It's for whatever I need it to be for, Leo. Right now, it's for making a bird. He shifted, sliding an inch closer on the rug. The man with the scar, he had a knife too. A big one. I know, I said, finally looking him in the eye. I didn't soften my gaze. I treated him like an equal. But he didn't know how to use it. He used it to scare people. That's a weakness. A knife is a tool. Fear is a tool. You have to be the one holding the handle. Leo watched me for a long time. Slowly, he reached out and touched the sleeve of my black turtleneck. You look different today. You don't smell like the rain anymore. I'm wearing a disguise, I whispered, leaning in as if sharing a state secret. Just like you. He looked down at his tuxedo pants. I hate these. They're tight. Then take them off, I said. Find something you can run in. Because in this house, Leo, we're going to be doing a lot of running. For the first time, a tiny, ghost-like smile touched his lips. He dropped the dinosaur and stood up. Across the room, I saw Smith Douglas standing in the shadows of the hallway, watching through the glass. He wasn't looking at his son. He was looking at the way I held the knife, with the practiced, effortless grip of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for the next attack. I had gained the boy's trust, but as I caught Smith's icy reflection in the glass, I realized I had also confirmed his greatest fear. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a professional. And in a house full of traitors, that made me the most dangerous person in the room. Would you like me to continue with? The penthouse was a labyrinth of silence and shadows after midnight. I moved through the corridors with the practiced ease of a phantom, my bare feet memorizing the rhythm of the security patrols. Marcus and his team were predictable. They relied on the hum of the electronic locks and the sweep of the infrared sensors. They didn't understand that a sensor is only as good as the person monitoring it, and tonight, the man on the monitors was distracted by a high-stakes poker app on his phone. I reached the heavy, double doors of Smith's private study. This wasn't just an office, it was the nerve center of Douglas International. If there was a paper trail or a digital footprint belonging to the traitor, it would be hidden here, buried beneath layers of corporate encryption and mahogany. The lock was a biometric hybrid, but I didn't need a fingerprint. I had watched Smith enter his code from the reflection in a silver tray earlier that evening. 0-4-1-2, the date of his wife's death, or perhaps the boy's birth. I pressed the digits, the soft haptic click echoing like a heartbeat in the still air. The door hissed open. Inside, the room smelled of old paper and expensive scotch. I made my way to the desk, my small flashlight casting a narrow, surgical beam over the surfaces. I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for the logs Marcus claimed didn't exist, the manual override records for the subway station feed. I was hunched over the terminal, my fingers dancing across the keys to bypass the screensaver, when the lights didn't just turn on, they surged. "You're far more industrious than a nanny has any right to be," Smith's voice cut through the room like a blade. I froze, then slowly straightened, turning to face him. He was standing by the bookshelf, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man haunted by his own fortress. "I'm doing the job you hired me for," I said, keeping my voice level. "Marcus is hiding the logs." I wanted to see why. "And did you?" He stepped into the light, his eyes tracking the way I stood between him and his computer. "I found enough. He's been scrubbing the timestamps. He's not just a rat, Mr. Douglas. He's a janitor cleaning up a crime scene." Smith's gaze shifted from the computer to me. He looked tired, not the exhaustion of a long day, but the weariness of a man who realized his entire world was built on shifting sand. "Turn around, Alara." The command was quiet, but it carried an edge I hadn't heard before. I stiffened. "I'm not finished with the data." "Turn around." He walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. I realized then that in my haste to reach the study, I had thrown on a thin, silk robe over a camisole, one of the items left in my room. The silk was fine, almost translucent under the harsh LED tracks of the study. As I turned my back to him, I felt the air grow cold. I heard the soft clink of his glass hitting the desk. Then, I felt the ghost of a touch, not a hand, but the heat of his presence, as he stepped close behind me. The light from the desk lamp hit me at an angle, throwing the map of my life into sharp relief. The skin of my back wasn't the smooth, porcelain surface of the women who usually occupied this penthouse. It was a landscape of silver lines, jagged puckers, and the deep, circular indentation of a cigarette burn near my shoulder blade. Some were from the streets, reminders of nights when I wasn't fast enough or the winter was too cruel. Others were older, deeper, and far more systematic. I felt his breath hitch. It was the first time I had heard the city's most feared alpha lose his composure. "Who did this to you?" he whispered. The growl was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged curiosity. "The world did," I replied, staring at a painting on the far wall without seeing it. Some of it was a choice. Most of it was the price of staying alive. I expected him to recoil. Most people did. They saw the scars and saw a victim, or worse, someone damaged. But Smith didn't pull away. He reached out, his thumb grazing the long, jagged line that ran from my spine to my ribs, a souvenir from a night in an alleyway 3 months ago. His touch was surprisingly warm, almost reverent. "They look like lightning bolts," he murmured. I turned my head, looking at him over my shoulder. Our faces were inches apart. For a moment, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't the billionaire, and I wasn't the vagrant. We were just two people who had survived the dark. I saw the reflection of my own hardness in his eyes, but I also saw a flicker of something he usually kept locked behind a vault door, empathy. We both have them, Smith, I said softly. Yours are just on the inside. You built this glass tower to keep everyone out, but all it does is make it easier for people to see what you're protecting. His hand dropped, but he didn't move away. The vulnerability in the room was suffocating, more dangerous than the Glock he had leveled at me the night before. The logs, he said, his voice regaining its steel, though it was thinner than usual. If Marcus is the one, I want him brought to me. I don't want him arrested. I want him erased. I'll find the proof, I promised, pulling my robe tighter around my shoulders, shielding the map of my past from his gaze once more. But don't mistake my help for loyalty to you. I'm doing this for Leo. Smith looked at the blank computer screen, then back at me. A small, grim smile touched his lips. That's the most honest thing anyone in this building has said to me in years. He picked up his glass and walked toward the window, looking out at the city he thought he owned. I slipped out of the room, the silence of the penthouse feeling heavier than before. He had seen my scars, and in doing so, he had seen the one thing I never wanted to reveal, that I wasn't just a ghost. I was human. The morning air in Central Park was deceptively crisp, tasting of autumn leaves and the faint, metallic tang of the city. To anyone else, it was a picturesque Saturday. To me, it was a kill zone. I had insisted on the outing for Leo. The boy was beginning to wilt within the sterile, glass and steel confines of the penthouse, his eyes growing vacant again. He needed grass under his feet, but more importantly, I needed to draw the rat out into the open. Smith had protested, his jaw setting into that familiar line of granite, but he had eventually yielded. He followed 10 paces behind us, flanked by Marcus and 2 other suits who scanned the horizon with the twitchy energy of men who knew they were failing at their jobs. Leo clutched my hand. His grip was small but surprisingly firm. We walked toward a secluded grove of elms, away from the main thoroughfare. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, not the prickle of paranoia, but the cold, certain hum of a tactical shift in the environment. The birds in the nearest elm had gone silent. Stay close to the trunk, Leo, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. We're going to play a game. You're the rabbit, and you have to stay hidden. Is it the man with the scar? He asked, his voice trembling but his feet already moving toward the shadow of a massive oak. No, I said, my eyes scanning the rooftop of the boathouse 300 yards away. It's someone else. The first shot didn't make a sound, a suppressed, high-velocity round that whistled past my ear and shattered a stone birdbath inches from where Smith was standing. Sniper. Marcus screamed, lunging toward Smith to tackle him to the dirt. But I wasn't looking at the boathouse anymore. The shot had been a feint, a way to force the targets into a predictable cluster. I saw the glint of sun on steel from a different direction, the dense thicket of bushes to our left. A man stepped out, dressed in the nondescript joggers of a morning runner, but his gait was all wrong. He moved with the heavy, centered weight of a soldier. He pulled a submachine gun from a discarded gym bag. Down! I roared. I didn't wait for the guards to react. I lunged at Leo, shielding his small body with mine as the first spray of lead tore through the park benches. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of ozone and splintered wood. Marcus and his men were scrambling, drawing their sidearms, but they were pinned behind a low stone wall, outmatched by the shooter's position. I watched the shooter's rhythm. He wasn't spraying wildly, he was firing in controlled, 3-round bursts, moving with a familiarity that suggested he knew exactly how Douglas's security team was trained to retreat. He was aiming for Smith. Leo, don't move, I commanded. I rolled away from the oak tree, drawing the shooter's attention. He pivoted, his barrel tracking me. I wasn't running in a straight line, I was a blur of black fabric and desperate intent, weaving through the trees. He fired, a burst clipping the bark of a tree just above my head, raining splinters into my hair. I reached into my waistband and pulled out the one thing I had managed to smuggle past Marcus that morning, a tactical flashbang I'd lifted from the security locker during my midnight raid. I cooked the pin for a heartbeat and hurled it. The world turned white. The roar of the explosion echoed off the surrounding buildings, followed by the high-pitched whine of shattered eardrums. In the chaos of the smoke, I didn't run away. I ran at him. The shooter was reeling, blinking back the glare, his weapon swinging aimlessly. I closed the distance in 4 seconds. I didn't use a gun, I used the momentum of my body and the jagged edge of the silver folding knife. I drove my shoulder into his chest, knocking the wind from his lungs, and swept his legs. We hit the grass hard. I pinned his arm with my knee and pressed the blade against the soft skin beneath his jaw. "Look at me," I hissed. He gasped, his eyes finally clearing. He wasn't a stranger. He was older than the men in the penthouse, his face weathered by sun and violence. Behind us, I heard Marcus and Smith approaching, their boots pounding the turf. "Vickers?" Smith's voice was a low, dangerous snarl. The shooter let out a wet, hacking laugh, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue. He looked at Smith with a mixture of hatred and pity. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Douglas. The board, they don't want a king anymore. They want an empty chair." "Vickers was your head of security for 6 years, wasn't he?" I asked, not moving the knife an inch. I looked up at Smith, whose face had turned a ghostly shade of gray. "He didn't just find us. He was told where the rabbit was going to be." I looked at Marcus, who was standing a few feet back, his gun still raised, his hands shaking more violently than ever. He wasn't looking at the assassin, he was looking at me with pure, unadulterated terror. "It wasn't just a kidnapping in the subway, Smith," I said, my voice cold as the Atlantic. "It was a rehearsal. And your former lieutenant just proved my theory. The call is coming from inside the house." Vickers looked at me, a flicker of recognition in his dying bravado. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the ghost you forgot to bury," I whispered. I felt Smith's hand on my shoulder, a heavy, grounding weight. He wasn't looking at his old friend Vickers. He was looking at the way I held the knife, the way I had neutralized a professional hitman while his own hand-picked team had cowered behind a wall. "Get the boy," Smith said to Marcus, his voice devoid of any emotion. Then he looked at me. "And Alara? Don't let go of that knife. You're going to need it." The basement of the Douglas estate was a place the architects had never intended for the light of day. Tucked beneath the wine cellar and the reinforced concrete of the panic room, it was a soundproofed vault of cold steel and industrial drainage. The air here was stagnant, stripped of the cedar and lavender scents that masked the upper floors. Here, the world smelled of damp stone and the sharp, ozone tang of a running generator. Vickers was strapped to a heavy metal chair in the center of the room. He was no longer the defiant soldier from the park. His jogging suit was torn and stained with the green of the grass and the red of his own failures. A single overhead bulb swayed slightly, casting long, rhythmic shadows that made the room feel like it was breathing. Smith stood in the shadows, his tailored blazer discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows with surgical precision. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like an executioner. On a small rolling cart beside him sat a kit that didn't belong in a home, surgical clamps, a high-voltage cattle prod, and a bottle of industrial saline. "I gave you everything, Arthur," Smith said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It wasn't the roar of a wounded lion, it was the steady hum of a machine. "I paid for your daughter's tuition. I cleared your gambling debts in Macau. I trusted you with the life of my son." Vickers spat a glob of blood onto the floor. "You bought me, Smith. There's a difference. And someone else offered a higher buyout." I stood by the heavy steel door, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll as Smith picked up the saline bottle. I had seen violence on the streets, desperate, chaotic brawls over a dry piece of cardboard or a bottle of rotgut, but this was different. This was clinical. This was the dark side of the alpha I had seen in the penthouse. Smith didn't hesitate. He poured the saline directly into the open knife wound I had given Vickers's shoulder. The scream that ripped from Vickers's throat was raw and jagged, vibrating against the concrete walls until it seemed to echo inside my own skull. I flinched, my fingers digging into my biceps. I wanted to turn away, to run back up to the sunlight where Leo was safe, but I forced my eyes to stay open. The name, Smith demanded, his face inches from the assassin's. Who on my board gave you the override codes? Who told you about the park? Go to hell, Vickers wheezed, his head sagging. Smith reached for the cattle prod. The blue spark hissed in the dim light, a predatory sound that made the hair on my arm stand up. He pressed it against Vickers's ribs, and the room filled with the smell of scorched fabric and burning skin. Stop, I whispered, the word escaping before I could catch it. Smith paused, the blue light reflecting in his ice-colored eyes. He turned to look at me, and for a second, I didn't recognize him. The man who had touched the scars on my back with such reverence was gone. In his place was a monster forged from the need to protect his legacy. You think this is cruel, Alara? Smith asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. Cruelty is dragging a 6-year-old child through a subway station. Cruelty is firing a submachine gun into a public park. I am not being cruel. I am being thorough. He's going to go into shock before he tells you anything, I said, stepping forward into the light. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I kept my voice steady. You're hurting him because you're angry. You're hurting him because you feel guilty that you didn't see it coming. Smith's jaw tightened, the muscle leaping in his cheek. He looked like he was a second away from turning that spark on me. But then, he looked down at his own hands, which were trembling slightly. He tried to take Leo, Smith said, and the sudden crack in his voice hit me harder than any physical blow. They will keep coming until I burn out the nest. I will do whatever I have to do to make sure my son sleeps through the night. In that moment, the horror in my gut shifted into something else, something uncomfortably familiar. I looked at Smith and I didn't see a monster, I saw a mirror. I thought of the night I had lunged at the kidnapper with a broken bottle. I hadn't thought about the law, or morality, or the soul I was staining. I had only thought about the light in that boy's eyes and my absolute, violent need to keep it from going out. We were the same. We were both predators born from the need to guard something precious. My scars were on my skin, his were being written onto his conscience in this basement. I walked over to the cart and picked up a clean cloth. I stepped past Smith and wiped the blood from Vickers's chin. The assassin looked at me, his eyes clouded with pain, seeking a mercy I wasn't sure I had left to give. He's right, Vickers, I said softly, leaning close to his ear. He won't stop. And I won't stop him. Because I'm the one who has to look Leo in the eye tomorrow morning. If you don't give us a name, I'm going to walk out of this room and let him do whatever he thinks is necessary. And trust me, you haven't seen his dark side yet. Vickers looked from me to Smith, seeing the same cold, unwavering resolve in both our faces. He realized then that there was no good cop in this room. There was only the father and the ghost. The treasurer, Vickers croaked, his spirit finally snapping. Highsmith. He's the one, he's been funneling the payments through a shell company in Panama. He's meeting the others tonight at the gala. Smith dropped the cattle prod. It hit the floor with a hollow clang. He didn't thank Vickers. He didn't even look at him. He turned and walked toward the exit, his shoulders slumped for just a fraction of a second before he regained his posture. As I followed him out, leaving the guards to deal with the broken man in the chair, Smith stopped at the base of the stairs. He didn't look back at me. You should hate me for what you just saw, he said. I've seen worse things for much smaller reasons, Smith, I replied, reaching out to touch his arm. He was cold, despite the heat of the basement. I don't hate you for being a father. But from now on, let me be the one who goes into the basement. You need to stay clean enough for Leo to still want to hold your hand. Smith finally looked at me, and the ice in his eyes thawed into something aching and raw. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine with a desperate, crushing grip. We stood there in the dark, two monsters bound by a single, fragile thread of love for a boy who was sleeping peacefully 3 floors above us. The transformation was total, a masterpiece of deception orchestrated by a fleet of tailors and stylists who treated my body like a canvas for Smith's social camouflage. I stood before the full-length mirror in the master suite, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The grease-stained coat and matted hair were gone, replaced by a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that clung to my curves like a second skin. It was backless, a daring choice that left my scars exposed to the world, but Smith had insisted. He said we weren't just flushing out a traitor, we were announcing a queen. They expect a victim, Smith said, stepping into the room behind me. He was in a tuxedo that made him look like a lethal weapon wrapped in velvet. He moved closer, his gaze dropping to the silver lines etched into my skin. Let them see the steel instead. He fastened a necklace around my throat, diamonds that felt like ice against my collarbone. His fingers lingered on the nape of my neck, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. Tonight, the mission was simple but treacherous, a private dinner party for the Douglas International Board. I wasn't the nanny or the investigator. I was Alara Vance, the mysterious fiancée Smith had kept hidden in the shadows. We were the bait, and the room would be full of sharks. The dinner was a masterclass in tension. The dining room was a cathedral of gold leaf and crystal, filled with the city's most powerful players. Highsmith, the treasurer, sat across from us, his smile as oily as the vintage Bordeaux in his glass. Every time I laughed at one of Smith's rehearsed anecdotes, or leaned in to whisper a secret into his ear, I felt the eyes of the board members raking over me. They were looking for the weakness, the flaw in the narrative. You're very quiet, Mr. Highsmith, I said, tilting my head as I caught his gaze over the rim of my champagne flute. Smith tells me you're the man who keeps the gears of this empire turning. It must be exhausting, keeping so many secrets in balance. Highsmith's hand faltered for a fraction of a second, a bead of wine spilling onto the white linen. I simply manage the numbers, Miss Vance. It's Smith who provides the drama. Is that what you call it? Smith's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He reached under the table, his hand finding my thigh and squeezing with a possessive heat that wasn't in the script. I call it survival. Throughout the night, the act intensified. We weren't just playing a role, we were feeding off each other's adrenaline. Every brush of his hand against my waist, every lingering look we shared across the table, began to blur the line between the mission and the truth. By the time the last guest had departed and the heavy oak doors of the penthouse clicked shut, the silence between us was no longer cold. It was combustible. The adrenaline of the hunt hadn't faded, it had curdled into something raw and hungry. We stood in the center of the darkened living room, the city lights shimmering behind us like a sea of fallen stars. Smith reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his eyes dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with the board members or the traitor. You were perfect, he whispered, his voice rough. I was a lie, I corrected, though my breath was hitching in my chest. No, he said, stepping into my space, his heat radiating through the silk of my dress. The dress was a lie. The diamonds were a lie. But the way you looked at me, the way you held my hand when you knew the danger was inches away, that wasn't an act. He didn't wait for me to answer. He crushed his lips to mine, a desperate, bruising kiss that tasted of champagne and shared secrets. I didn't pull away. I didn't run. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, needing to feel the weight of him against the hollow ache in my chest. We moved to the bedroom in a fever of silk and discarded lace. For the first time, I wasn't a ghost in his house, and he wasn't the titan on the hill. When he saw my scars in the moonlight, really saw them, he didn't look away. He kissed every one of them, his touch a silent vow of protection and recognition. In the quiet aftermath, tangled in the high thread count sheets, the world felt small and fragile. The traitor was still out there, and the games were only getting more wicked, but for one night, the armor was off. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. What happens tomorrow? I asked into the dark. Smith pulled me closer, his chin resting on the top of my head. Tomorrow, we finish it. But tonight, Alara, you're the only thing that's real. The morning light felt like a trespasser. It bled through the sheer curtains of the master suite, illuminating the tangled sheets and the heavy, weighted silence of a room where too many secrets had been traded for intimacy. I watched the rise and fall of Smith's shoulders as he slept, a rare moment of peace on a face usually etched in stone. For a heartbeat, I wanted to stay there, to believe that Alara Vance was a real person and that this life of silk and security was my own. But the ghost inside me was restless. The adrenaline of the gala had left a bitter aftertaste, a reminder that we had flushed the rats, but we hadn't yet found the nest. I slipped out of bed, moving with the silence of a shadow. I didn't go back to the guest wing. Instead, I returned to the study. Smith had given me his biometric override in the heat of the night, a gesture of trust that felt more significant than any diamond. I needed to know why Highsmith, a man of numbers, had been so bold. A treasurer doesn't move against a king unless he has a better crown waiting in the wings. The computer hummed to life, the blue light reflecting in the glass of the mahogany desk. I bypassed the main directories, diving into the deep storage archives, the encrypted files that even the board didn't know existed. My fingers flew across the keys, my mind working with the cold, analytical precision that had once made me the top investigative reporter at the Chronicle. I dug through the offshore accounts and the shell companies Vickers had mentioned. I followed a trail of breadcrumbs hidden in the legal fees of a defunct subsidiary. The payments weren't just going to Highsmith, they were being routed through a private server in Geneva. I initiated a brute force decryption on a file titled Project Monarch. The progress bar crawled. 10%. 30. I looked at a framed photo on the desk, Smith, a younger, less guarded version of himself, standing next to a man who shared his jawline but had eyes full of a restless, volatile energy. Julian Douglas. Smith's younger brother, the one he had told me was traveling abroad for the last 3 years. The one Smith protected with a fierce, quiet loyalty, despite Julian's history of squandering the family's wealth. The computer chimed. The file opened. It wasn't just bank statements. It was a blueprint of the Douglas Empire's security architecture, annotated with red lines. Every weak point, every camera blind spot, and the specific override codes for the subway station. Attached to the blueprint was a correspondence thread with the Vane Syndicate, Smith's primary rivals. The extraction of the asset, Leo, will force Smith to liquidate the trust. Once the liquidity is moved to the Geneva account, the merger is inevitable. I'll be the only Douglas left to sign the papers. The signature at the bottom of the last email wasn't Highsmith's. It was Julian's. He wasn't traveling, he was the architect of his own nephew's kidnapping. He was working with the very people who wanted Smith dead. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? The voice came from the darkened corner of the library, near the spiral staircase. I didn't scream, but every muscle in my body turned to wire. I slowly turned the monitor away, but it was too late. Julian Douglas stepped into the light. He looked like the photo, but the 3 years had added a sharp, predatory edge to his features. He held a glass of scotch in one hand and a thin, manila folder in the other. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo, he was in a casual sweater that made his relaxed posture even more terrifying. I expected my brother to find a bodyguard, Julian said, his voice a melodic mimicry of Smith's. I didn't expect him to find a lover. And I certainly didn't expect him to hire a woman who's been dead for 6 months. He tossed the folder onto the desk. It slid across the wood, stopping inches from my hand. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Alara Vance, he continued, leaning against the bookshelf. Former investigative lead for the Chronicle. The woman who nearly took down the Vane Syndicate last year. The woman whose car, accidentally, went over a bridge when she got too close to the truth. Everyone thought you were at the bottom of the river, but you were just hiding in the gutters, waiting for a new lead. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out. The homeless woman persona hadn't just been a disguise, it had been a witness protection program of my own making. I had used the Douglas kidnapping as a way back in, a way to finish the story that had nearly killed me. Smith doesn't know, does he? Julian smirked, enjoying the silence. He thinks you're a guardian angel with a tragic past. He doesn't realize he's sleeping with a journalist who's just looking for her next front page headline. Imagine what that will do to his trust once I tell him. You won't tell him anything, Julian, I said, my hand sliding toward the silver folding knife hidden in my robe. Because if you do, I'll upload these files to every federal server in the country. You're not just a traitor to your brother, you're a felon. Julian's smile didn't fade. He took a slow sip of his scotch. You won't have time for that, Alara. Because unlike my brother, I don't care about your scars. And I certainly don't care about your silence. He reached into the small of his back, and the glint of a silenced pistol caught the morning sun. My heart hammered. I was trapped between the desk and the brother of the man I had just started to love, and the truth was a weapon that was about to go off in all our faces. The click of the silenced pistol was a sound of finality, but Julian didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he smiled, a slow, sickly expression of triumph that made my skin crawl. He didn't need to kill me yet, he had a much more surgical way to destroy me. You really should have stayed in the river, Alara, he whispered. Before I could lunge, the study doors burst open. Smith stood there, his hair sleep-mussed, his eyes searching for me with a warmth that vanished the moment he saw Julian. But Julian didn't flinch. He dropped his weapon onto the rug and threw his hands up, his face contorting into a mask of pure, frantic terror. Smith! Thank God, Julian cried out, his voice cracking with rehearsed desperation. I caught her. She was at the terminal. She's been transmitting the encryption keys to the Vane Syndicate for the last hour. I froze, the silver knife still gripped in my hand. Smith's gaze darted from his brother to me, then to the monitor behind me, where the decrypted files of Project Monarch were still glaringly visible. To anyone else, it looked like I had found the truth. To a man who had just opened his heart for the first time in years, it looked like I was stealing his life's work. Smith, no, I said, my voice steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. Julian is the one. He's the one working with them. I found the emails, the Geneva accounts. She's lying. Julian shouted, pointing at the folder on the desk. Look at the file, Smith. She's not some homeless woman. She's Alara Vance, the journalist. She's been using you for a story. She's been working with Vane from the start to dismantle the company from the inside. Why do you think she was conveniently at the subway station just in time to save Leo? It was a setup to get her through the front door. Smith walked to the desk, his movements heavy, like a man wading through deep water. He picked up the folder. I watched his eyes scan the clippings of my past, the photos of my death, and the investigative reports on the Vane Syndicate. The silence in the room became a physical weight, crushing the air out of my lungs. He looked at me, and the ice in his eyes was back, but this time, it was shattered. Is it true? He asked. His voice was a hollowed-out rasp. Are you a journalist? Yes, I said, the word feeling like a lead weight. But Smith, I wasn't working for Vane. They tried to kill me. I was trying to stop them. And did you come here for the story? He interrupted, stepping closer, his presence suddenly suffocating. Did you save my son because it was the right thing to do, or because it was the perfect lead? At first, it was the story, I admitted, my heart breaking as I saw the light die in his eyes. But then it became about you. And Leo. Smith, look at the monitor. Julian's name is all over those files. Julian let out a dry, mocking laugh. I noticed the breach and tried to stop her, Smith. She's encrypted the drive with a secondary password. She's framing me because I caught her red-handed. Smith didn't look at the monitor. He looked at the woman who had shared his bed, who had seen his scars and showed him her own. In his world, betrayal was the only constant, and I had just confirmed his darkest suspicion, that everyone has a price, and everyone is a liar. Marcus. Smith roared. The head of security appeared instantly, followed by 2 guards. Marcus's face was a mask of grim satisfaction as he saw me cornered. Lock her in the sub-level holding room, Smith commanded, not looking at me. And Julian, go to the guest wing. We'll talk when I've decided what to do with her. Smith, listen to me. I shouted as Marcus grabbed my arms, his fingers bruising my skin. Julian is going to finish what he started. Leo isn't safe. Smith didn't answer. He turned his back on me, staring out at the city he thought he had protected. The doors to the study slammed shut, echoing like the lid of a casket. The sub-level cell was a cold, concrete box designed for the enemies of Douglas International. There were no windows, only a heavy steel door with a reinforced slit. I sat on the edge of the narrow cot, my mind racing. Julian was clever. He had used the truth of my identity to mask the lie of his innocence. He knew Smith's trauma was his greatest blind spot. I looked at the silver folding knife Marcus had missed during his rough search. I had tucked it into the lining of my sleeve when they grabbed me. It was a small tool, but it was all I had. I didn't have much time. Julian wouldn't wait for Smith to calm down. He would move now, while the house was in chaos and Smith was blinded by fury. I knelt by the door, examining the electronic lock. It was a high-frequency system, but like all things in this house, it relied on a hardwired bypass for emergencies. I took the knife and began to unscrew the faceplate of the ventilation duct near the floor. My fingers were raw, the metal biting into my skin, but I didn't stop. I crawled into the narrow, dusty space, the scent of old grease and cold air filling my lungs. I was a ghost again, moving through the veins of the house I had tried to save. I reached the wiring junction for the door. I didn't need a code, I just needed to create a short that would trigger the fail-open safety protocol. I stripped the ends of 2 wires with my teeth, the copper tasting of pennies and desperation. The spark was bright, stinging my eyes, followed by the sweet, mechanical thunk of the bolt retracting. I tumbled back into the cell and pushed the door open. The hallway was empty, the guards likely moved to the upper floors to protect the rightful Douglas family. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the stairs. I had to find Leo. Because if Julian was the traitor, the boy wasn't a hostage anymore. He was the final obstacle. The basement of Julian's estate smelled of damp earth and old copper, a tomb for the living that he had designed specifically to break her spirit. But Julian had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman he held captive. Elara sat in the darkness, her wrists chafed raw by the zip ties, listening to the muffled vibrations of orchestral music drifting down from the floors above. It was the night of the Black Masquerade, the apex of the city's social calendar and the moment Julian intended to cement his coup. The rhythmic thrum of the bass became her metronome. She didn't struggle against the plastic restraints with panicked strength. Instead, she used the sharp, protruding screw of the metal chair leg, methodically sawing the plastic until it snapped with a sharp crack that was swallowed by a burst of fireworks outside. Escaping the cellar was a blur of adrenaline and predatory instinct. She moved through the service corridors like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She found her way to the dressing rooms where the hired staff prepared, and with the practiced hand of someone who had spent years surviving on the fringes, she liberated a floor-length cloak and a discarded porcelain mask. She didn't need a gown to belong. The masquerade was built on the lie of anonymity, and tonight, that lie would be Julian's undoing. She slipped into the grand ballroom just as the tension in the room reached its breaking point. The scene was a fever dream of gold leaf and velvet. At the far end of the hall, Julian stood on a raised dais, his face obscured by a mask of polished obsidian. Beside him, Leo was strapped into an ornate chair, looking pale and hollowed out, a trophy of Julian's ruthlessness. The elite of the underworld watched, glasses of vintage crystal in hand, as Julian began his proclamation. He spoke of necessary transitions, and the weakness of the old guard, his voice dripping with the arrogant certainty of a man who thought he had already won. He was so distracted by his own theater that he didn't notice the hooded figure moving toward the tech booth, nor did he see the flickering of the massive LED screens that lined the ballroom walls. Elara didn't scream for attention, she commanded it. With a single keystroke on the master console, she overrode the gala's presentation. The ambient music cut to a harrowing silence, replaced by the grainy, intercepted audio of Julian's secret meetings with the rival families, the cold, calculated plans to liquidate the PAC's assets and the admission that he had been the one to orchestrate Leo's kidnapping to frame Smith. The room erupted. The masks of the guests couldn't hide the shift from admiration to murderous outrage. Ilara threw back her hood, stepping into the center of the light, her eyes locked on Julian's trembling form. Before his security could react, she was a whirlwind of movement, seizing a decorative saber from a wall display and cutting through Leo's bindings in one fluid motion. As the crowd surged forward to demand accountability from the traitor, the heavy doors at the front of the hall swung open to reveal the true alpha. Smith entered the room not with a roar, but with the terrifying stillness of a predator that had finally found its mark. The chaos died down as he walked through the parted crowd, his eyes never leaving Ilara. Julian was dragged away by the very men he had tried to lead, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. But as the dust settled and the threat was neutralized, the atmosphere changed. The power in the room shifted toward the woman standing over the rescued boy. Smith approached her, the man who had built an empire on blood and unyielding pride. He looked at the girl he had tried to bribe, the woman who had saved his legacy when he was too blind to see the rot in his own house. In front of the remaining heads of the 5 families, in the middle of the most prestigious ballroom in the city, Smith did something that violated every law of the Alpha. He didn't offer a handshake or a cold thank you. He sank to his knees, his forehead nearly touching the floor at Ilara's feet. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. An Alpha never knelt, yet here was the most powerful man in the state, prostrate before a woman the world had deemed invisible. He spoke her name, his voice cracking with a raw, guttural sincerity as he begged for her forgiveness, for his arrogance, for his doubt, and for the insult of his initial offer. Ilara looked down at him, her hand trembling as she reached out to lift his chin. She saw the man behind the monster, and in that moment of absolute vulnerability, she found her answer. She didn't just forgive him, she claimed the space beside him. As he rose, guided by her hand, she took her place at his side, no longer a victim of the streets or a secret to be kept, but the true heartbeat of the empire.